All right, let's start here in Africa, where leaders of the African Union have adopted a historic resolution describing slavery, deportation, and colonialism as genocide and crimes against the people of Africa.
The conference recognized, colonization as a crime against humanity. That's very important. And we also the conference expressed its solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian people.
On February 15, 2026, African leaders gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for the 39th Ordinary Session of the African Union Assembly and made a declaration that centuries of history had been building toward. They adopted a resolution formally classifying slavery, deportation, colonialism, and apartheid as crimes against humanity and genocide against the people of Africa. This was not a symbolic gesture or a feel-good statement for domestic consumption. This was a coordinated continental strategy designed to take the fight for reparations and historical justice to the United Nations, to international courts, and to former colonial powers who have spent decades avoiding this conversation. And it is happening right now. The resolution does not just acknowledge that terrible things happened in the past. It goes much further than that, by using specific legal language that carries weight in international law. By classifying these acts as crimes against humanity and genocide, the African Union is invoking two of the most serious categories of violations recognized under international legal frameworks. Crimes against humanity are defined as systematic attacks against civilian populations, and they are considered so severe that there is no statute of limitations on prosecution. Genocide, as defined by the 1948 UN Convention, includes acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Both classifications open pathways for legal accountability that vague acknowledgments of historical wrongs do not. Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama, serving as the African Union champion for advancing the cause of justice and the payment of reparations, addressed the Assembly and described the moment as one that all peoples of African descent worldwide have been waiting for. He stated that the truth cannot be buried, that the legal foundations are sound, and that the moral imperative is undeniable. That language was carefully chosen. Mahama was not appealing to sympathy or goodwill. He was making a legal and moral argument that the transatlantic slave trade and NAF colonialism meet the threshold for the gravest crimes recognized by international law, and that those crimes demand accountability and redress. The resolution builds on momentum that has been building throughout 2025, which the African Union designated as the Year of Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through reparations. That designation was not symbolic either. It came with concrete institutional development, including the establishment of an O coordination team on reparations, an O committee of experts on reparations, and a reference group of legal experts tasked with providing technical and legal guidance. These are not ceremonial committees. They are working groups designed to build the legal architecture needed to pursue reparations claims in international forums. The foundation was laid even earlier at a conference in Algiers, Algeria on December 1, 2025, where African leaders, diplomats, and scholars gathered specifically to examine the crimes of colonialism and their enduring legacies. That conference produced the Algiers Declaration, which called for the criminalization of colonialism in all its forms and the pursuit of restorative justice. The declaration condemned the glorification of those responsible for colonial crimes and demanded the restitution of cultural property, archives, and human remains illegitimately held by former colonizing countries. It also established November 30th as the African Day of Tribute to African martyrs and victims of the transatlantic slave trade, colonization, and apartheid, creating an annual continental observance tied directly to the reparations agenda. But the most significant development is what comes next. The African Union has drafted a resolution that will be presented to the United Nations General Assembly on March 25, 2026. That date was chosen deliberately because it coincides with the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a date the UN set aside to honor the millions affected by centuries of forced displacement. Ghana will formally table the resolution, and informal consultations with other UN member states are scheduled to take place between February 23rd and March 12th to build consensus and secure co-sponsors. The objective, as Mahama described it, is to achieve global recognition of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. Now, You might be wondering what actually changes if the UN General Assembly adopts this resolution. The General Assembly cannot convict states of crimes or force them to pay reparations. It does not have that legal authority. But what it can do is shift the international conversation in ways that create political and diplomatic pressure. When the General Assembly adopts a resolution, it signals that a particular issue has broad international support and legitimacy. It standardizes language that can be used in future negotiations and legal filings. It influences what topics receive sustained attention in international forums, and it provides a foundation for coordinated advocacy strategies across multiple countries and institutions. The resolution also ties into the broader global movement for reparations that has gained momentum in recent years. CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, has been actively pursuing reparations claims against European nations for their role in the transatlantic slave trade. Several Caribbean countries have established reparations commissions and are coordinating legal strategies. The African Union resolution explicitly expresses solidarity with CARICOM efforts and calls for full implementation of the Addis Ababa Declaration on the Transcontinental Partnership for Restorative Justice, which was adopted in September 2025. This is not Africa acting alone. This is the coordination of a global movement involving African nations, Caribbean nations, and diaspora communities worldwide. The historical context that makes this resolution necessary is staggering in scale. United Nations records indicate that the transatlantic slave trade, which spanned approximately 400 years, forcibly removed more than 15 million African men, women, and children to North and South America, the Caribbean, and Europe. That is just the number who survived the journey. Historians estimate that millions more died during capture, during the brutal Middle Passage across the Atlantic, or shortly after arrival. The demographic impact on Africa was catastrophic. Entire regions were depopulated. Social structures collapsed. Economies were reoriented around the capture and sale of human beings. And the ripple effects of that trauma are still visible today in patterns of underdevelopment, institutional weakness, and persistent inequality. Then came colonialism, which consolidated the exploitation into formal political structures. European powers carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 without input from any African leaders or consideration of existing political boundaries, ethnic groups, or social systems. They imposed extractive economic systems designed to benefit European industries and consumers. They seized land, coerced labor, destroyed local institutions, and redesigned entire economies around the export of raw materials to Europe. Infrastructure like railways and ports was built not to develop African economies, but to facilitate extraction. Education systems were designed to produce compliant workers and low-level administrators, not independent thinkers or entrepreneurs. Legal systems were imposed that prioritized protecting European property and enforcing European interests. When independence finally came in the 1960s and 1970s, African nations inherited economies that had been deliberately structured for extraction rather than development. They inherited borders that made no geographic or ethnic sense, leading to conflicts that persist to this day. They inherited weak institutions that lacked legitimacy and capacity. They inherited massive debts, often accumulated by colonial administrations or dictators, supported by former colonial powers. And they inherited a global economic system where the terms of trade, the rules of international finance, and the structure of global governance all reflected power imbalances created during the colonial era. Decolonization may have ended formal political control, but the economic and institutional legacies of colonialism remain deeply embedded in global structures. This is why the African Union resolution emphasizes that the crimes committed during slavery and colonialism are not just historical footnotes that can be acknowledged and then moved past. The resolution explicitly states that these acts inflicted systemic harm on African peoples and represent the most serious violations recognized under international law. It describes them as imprescriptible, meaning there is no time limit on pursuing accountability. And it commits African nations to advancing the international recognition of colonial crimes and working toward their explicit codification in international legal instruments. The resolution also addresses present-day manifestations of those historical crimes. It condemns all forms of neocolonialism, including political interference, economic exploitation, and the illegal presence of foreign forces or mercenaries on African soil. It deplores structures of global governance that continue to reflect power imbalances inherited from the colonial era and calls for rectification of these structural inequalities. This framing connects historical injustices with contemporary challenges, arguing that you cannot understand Africa's current position in the global economy without understanding how colonialism and slavery created and perpetuated that position. Former colonial powers have long resisted reparations claims by arguing that they cannot be held responsible for actions taken by previous generations, that slavery and colonialism were legal under the laws of the time, or that attempting to calculate and distribute reparations would be impossibly complex. The African Union resolution directly challenges all of those arguments. By classifying these acts as crimes against humanity and genocide, it asserts that they were violations of fundamental human rights, regardless of what domestic laws said at the time. By establishing expert committees and legal frameworks, it demonstrates that calculating and pursuing reparations, while complex, is entirely feasible. And by coordinating across 55 member states plus diaspora communities, it shows that this is not a fringe demand, but a unified continental position backed by hundreds of millions of people. The resolution also carries symbolic and diplomatic weight beyond its immediate legal implications. Invoking genocide, one of the gravest crimes under international law, elevates the conversation to a level that cannot be dismissed or minimized. It forces former colonial powers to respond, even if that response is defensive or dismissive, because silence becomes increasingly untenable when an entire continent is making formal accusations of genocide and crimes against humanity. It strengthens Africa's moral and political standing in international forums where debates about human rights, development aid, trade agreements, and climate finance are happening. And it creates a reference point that activists, scholars, lawyers, and policymakers can use to frame advocacy efforts for years to come. There is also a generational dimension to this moment that should not be overlooked. The leaders adopting this resolution are not the generation that fought for independence. They are not even the generation that came immediately after. They are leaders who have grown up in independent African nations, who have watched previous efforts at reparations fizzle out, and who are increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of change. They represent a shift in how African nations engage with the world, moving from defensive positioning and apologetic requests to assertive demands backed by legal arguments and coordinated strategy. That shift reflects broader changes in global power dynamics, where African nations are becoming more economically integrated with each other and with non-Western powers like China, reducing their dependence on former colonial nations and giving them more room to push back. The African Union has also declared that 2026 through 2036 will be the O decade on reparations, running alongside the UN's second international decade for people of African descent, which spans 2025 through 2034. That 10-year framework is designed to maintain sustained pressure and ensure that reparations remain a central issue rather than fading after initial attention. It signals that this is not a one-time campaign, but a long-term commitment to securing justice and accountability. So what happens next? The resolution goes to the UN General Assembly in March 2026, where Ghana will formally table it and seek broad support from member states. The informal consultations happening between late February and mid-March will be critical for building consensus and addressing concerns from countries that might be hesitant to support language that explicitly calls historical actions by their predecessors crimes against humanity and genocide. If the resolution passes with strong support, it becomes a reference point for future diplomatic efforts, legal cases, and advocacy campaigns. If it fails or passes with weak support, it reveals which countries are willing to publicly oppose accountability for slavery and colonialism, and that information can be used strategically in other forums. Beyond the UN, the African Union has indicated it will pursue reparations through multiple channels simultaneously. That includes coordinated diplomatic pressure, legal cases in international courts where possible, demands for restitution of cultural property and human remains, and bilateral negotiations with individual former colonial powers. The strategy is not to wait for a single big win, but to advance on multiple fronts, securing incremental victories that build momentum and demonstrate that reparations are not just a talking point, but an achievable goal. There are significant obstacles ahead. Former colonial powers like Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, and the Netherlands have shown little willingness to engage seriously with reparations claims. When pressed, they typically offer development aid or cultural exchange programs, which advocates argue are inadequate substitutes for genuine accountability and compensation. There are also challenges within Africa itself. including questions about how reparations would be distributed, which institutions would manage them, and how to ensure that payments actually benefit the descendants of those who suffered rather than being captured by corrupt elites or mismanaged by weak institutions. But the fact that these conversations are happening at the level of the African Union, with formal resolutions, expert committees, and coordinated strategies, represents a fundamental shift from where things stood even a decade ago. Reparations used to be discussed primarily in academic circles and activist spaces. Now it is being discussed by heads of state at continental summits and presented to the United Nations as a formal demand backed by legal arguments. That shift matters because it moves reparations from the realm of moral appeals into the realm of political negotiation and legal accountability. The African Union resolution adopted on February 15, 2026, is not the end of this process. It is the formalization of a beginning. It is the moment when Africa collectively decided that enough time had passed, that enough evidence had been gathered, and that the legal and moral case was strong enough to take to the world and demand recognition. Whether that demand will be met and what form any eventual reparations might take remains to be seen. But what is no longer in question is whether Africa is serious about pursuing justice for the crimes of slavery and colonialism. The resolution makes that commitment explicit, binding, and impossible to ignore. And that alone represents a historic moment that will shape how this conversation unfolds for years to come.